Hi there once again. I just have one more topic to finish off with what you've been learning with functions. Okay, now we've looked at functions and we've looked at inverse functions. Okay, so the inverse function for this function 2x plus 3 was y is equal to x by 2 minus 3 by 2. Alright, so there's something that happens to the domain and the range of an inverse function. Alright, now this is what happens. Alright, okay, so the actual function is fx 2x plus 3. Now the domain, let me restrict the domain. I mean, in the previous example I just didn't have a restriction on it. It was all real numbers, but whereas here let me put a restriction. Let me say the domain is greater than or equal to 0. That means the range, of course, would be greater than or equal to 3. Okay, because that's where the function starts. Okay, so if I were to sketch this one, it'll look something like this, because this point here is the intercept, which is 3. The x coordinate is 0. Okay, so that's how the actual function looks like. So the domain of the actual function is x is greater than or equal to 0, and the range is greater than or equal to 3. Okay, what happens to the inverse function? Okay, when you do the inverse function, the range of the actual function becomes the normal function, becomes the domain of the inverse function, and the domain of the normal function becomes the range of the inverse function. Alright, that's how it works out. Okay, now let's see how that looks when we sketch that. Alright, now the inverse function is this: y is equal to x by 2 minus 3 by 2. Alright, so I've got to start sketching that function when x is equal to 3. Okay, so when x is equal to 3, when I substitute that in, I think I didn't do that properly there. I need to substitute a 3 instead of x. Okay, so if I substitute a 3 instead of x, I get y is equal to 0. Okay, so that's my first y coordinate, and it indeed matches up with what I try to do here. My first x coordinate for the inverse function is 3, then my first y coordinate for my inverse function will be 0, and that's what I've got. So if I were to sketch this graph with this restriction, alright, the inverse function, my first x coordinate is 3 and my first y coordinate is 0. So my inverse graph will look something like that. Alright, and it's basically a reflection on the y is equal to x line. Okay, so that's the y is equal to x line. So that's what happens when you that's what happens to the domain and the range of a normal function. Okay, when you work out its inverse function, the range of the normal function becomes the domain of the inverse function, and the domain of the normal function becomes the range of the inverse function. Okay, good.